to my last question. I said there were 4 questions, and there'll be time for other questions, and even questions that you two may have of me or others. But that gets us to kind of, there's a lot of K-12 and higher educators who are either in this room or listening on the live feed, or who will be listening to this or viewing this later. And the question that we constantly have for ourselves, that Leo and I and others in this room constantly ask is, okay, what do we do in our classrooms? What does this mean? How do we teach? I'm a social studies teacher. Jefferson would laud long ago that democratic citizenship is not a natural state of grace where one is born, but it is the habits of living that one must learn and practice. Many of us talk about, you have to walk in each other's shoes. You have to see each other as people. What do we do as American educators? How do we respond to the expressions of hate and prejudice and the kind of bullying that now shows up in our classrooms each and every day? And frankly, how in a period of time when STEM is so important or when testing is so important, how do we teach in a way that kind of engages kids to think that either democracy matters, citizenship matters, voting matters, or things like that? I'm sure that's too open-ended and it's unfair to ask you all of that at the same time. But since we have both of you here, that is the question that most of us are thinking about every single day.
Well, I first of all want to say, and hopefully there are some folks watching out there, that I think the people who are best at answering that question are teachers who understand the challenges and the points of influence with young people. So in that regard, I will offer some thoughts, but with humility, I think the answers have to be worked out in practice by teachers. But I would say a couple of things. The first is just that as I think about educating young people for civic agency, I think that they need both a set of capacities, skills, know-how, experiences of empowerment, and then they also need bodies of civic knowledge. And I think it can be helpful just to sort of outline those two things as separable things. And I think this can help a little bit get around the polarization question. So for example, for the capacities piece, they need to know how to identify community problems, right? How to articulate the problem, how to find people who also care about that problem, brainstorm solutions, and then they need the sort of basic know-how of, well, given this is the problem, what are the levers to pull to actually change it, right? So that's all the sort of the how, the why, you're motivated because you care about problems in your own community, and the how, the kinds of things that you can actually pull and change to achieve something. What I've left out in that account is the what, how you decide what kind of solution is the right kind of solution. And that's where I would say different bodies of civic knowledge are relevant. And this is where we get into the polarization terrain, okay? Because you could have social justice civic knowledge that would give you one set of answers. You could have libertarian civic knowledge, would give you another set of answers. You could have what I call the sort of proceduralist civic knowledge, which is where you really believe in the democratic process as such, and sort of working through procedures is substantively the goal that you're after. Or you could have what I call sort of egalitarian participatory body of knowledge, civic knowledge, which is about the value to all of us as human beings of being change makers and building processes and experiences that support being a change maker. Okay, so like 4 different bodies of civic knowledge, they generate different kinds of policy solutions. Right? So there's a part of me that wonders whether we could short circuit some of the polarization conversation if we were a little more explicit about those sort of 4 different bodies of civic knowledge, expose kids to all 4 as a part of helping them pick the line they want to explore and understand more deeply. Maybe they pick the social justice line, maybe they pick the libertarian line. But in the process, hopefully we're also giving them the capacities to build dialogues across disagreement, spaces of disagreement, right? So capacities and skills, bodies of civic knowledge, and it all needs in some ways to be put in practice, not just book learning, not just paper learning, not just one-to-one communication learning, but active learning.
Would you require debate or a project? Like if you were Betsy DeVos. Oh no, we should say that larger. There should have been a much bigger no. But if Betsy DeVos called you tomorrow and said, "What should I do, Danielle?" Would you, off of your last comment, would you say to her, because if she called me tomorrow and asked me, she would do the exact opposite of what I would say. But would you actually push her or prod her to do that kind of project-based learning you were just talking about, or even debate across high school classrooms?
So I would, but I'll say one other thing, which is I actually think in order for us to make progress on rebuilding civic education, we need to let that conversation really operate at the level of the states and accept plurality, accept a diversity of approaches. And that's why I said, I really think this is about teachers, teachers experimenting. And my kind of request to teachers would be that they experiment self-consciously around the capacities piece, the skills, the know-how piece, the empowering agency piece, and that they experiment self-consciously around the different bodies of civic knowledge. So in some sense, my request to Secretary DeVos would be, can we incentivize this kind of experimentation for our teachers, and let our teachers show us the pathway forward on this. On the issue of debate, though, I want to just say quickly, I do think debate and action projects are really important. And but with debate, I think it's actually really important that students have to pull a position out of the hat. That is, they don't start by debating the thing that they already think they believe, and that they test their ability to argue another position all the way through. I think that's a hugely important thing. But the last thing I would say is, I believe that there's this secret dynamic opportunity in the Common Core, in the requirement that the Declaration of Independence be taught. That's everywhere, right? Almost everywhere, 40-something states still, right? Am I right about that? All right.
Well, it's called something else.
Okay.
But it is actually in the vast majority of states, there is a requirement somewhere in some place in K-12 or in high school, and primarily in high school, to actually teach the Declaration and to also teach a little bit of the Constitution.
But the Declaration, man, you can hang a heck of a lot of stuff on the Declaration. All right, so let me just remind you, okay? It's a how-to manual, all right? And that how-to manual goes, first you gotta figure out what your problem is, list of grievances, all right? And then you gotta figure out what your values are for having some solutions. All people are created equal, and we build governments to affect our safety and happiness together, right? That's in there, right? And you have to put together your grievances and the things you care about in a rhetorically effective structure that will bring you allies like Spain and France, not to mention everybody else in the colonies. And you've got to be committed to some actions at the end of it. In that particular case, putting on your battle gear, actually getting out there and fighting. But you've got the whole thing right there. The values, the policy problems, the policy solutions, the narratives to build allies, the approach to building allies, and the commitment to action. Boom, right there, Declaration of Independence, right? Start from the end, the little last bit where they say, we therefore resolve what they decide to do. Just have the kids read that and ask them to think about, how do you get to that point of resolving to do something, take an action? And what would you resolve to do? And then why? What are the problems? What are the values that motivate you? How do you build the community of solidarity around you to move this thing forward? Honestly, you don't need anything other than that text to build a whole civic education curriculum.
Wow. Okay, Tim, you get the last word on the 4 questions.
Okay, so even more than Danielle, and much more than Danielle. In fact, I'm an amateur on what to do in the classroom. So I'm gonna take the question very broadly, and look at classrooms from a perspective that's familiar to me, which is historically. I think the condition that you're describing as exceptional, Randy, is actually normal. It's normal for teachers to be teaching in an authoritarian, racist environment, unfortunately. I mean, historically speaking, that's typical. It's typical in this country. It's typical also, at least in the countries that I work on. And that means that, and here's the other side of it, that there are lots of positive examples of teachers who in those conditions have made a huge difference. In fact, as you were asking the question, I was thinking about the sociology of resistance in Eastern Europe, which is the part of the world that I work on. And it's striking how often the people who turn out to be the resistors of a generation actually go back to a particular classroom and a particular teacher, not necessarily university instructor, and not somebody who taught them to be revolutionaries, but usually somebody who taught them how to think and how to be together, and who gave them the kinds of habits that the two of you have been talking about, such that they were able to do other things together later in life. Actually, it's only a slight exaggeration to say that the leading resistors in Poland were people who knew each other literally from elementary school all the way through, right? And one could repeat that story across different generations. So this is just by way of saying that the teacher is always going to be an exceptional figure, an alternative source of authority. And sometimes you're dealt a hand where that's going to be harder, more full of friction than other times, but it's always going to be true. We're just in a historical moment where being a teacher or being a journalist counts for much more than it would at other times. So how to teach? I'm gonna say a bunch of things which I think are extremely conservative here, because I think in discussion of curriculum, I think we really do have room for a lot of common ground, and we have ways of getting across what I think is often a false polarization. I think a lot of the polarization takes place impersonally in this country, and I think a theme of this conversation is that some of it can be gotten over if we just find the right way to talk about it. And one way to talk about it, I think, is precisely the documents at the beginning of the history of this country. The Declaration also talks about what happens in the course of human events. To me, that's really important, like as a historian, really important. The course of human events, that things change. So this is why history is so important. And one of the things that's happened in the last 25 years is that we really have lost track of history. And I say this as somebody who spends a lot of time talking to Americans. For the last 15 years, I spent a lot of time in public talking to Americans about history. We really have let it go. And it's not just the things that we should know. It's more the process, because where we've gotten ourselves to is a mental state nationally where we think everything is just the way that it is, and it has to be this way, until it changes, and then we have no idea how to react to it, right? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, think of November of 2016, right? Everything has to be fine. Oh, but wait, it's not. Oh, but nothing like this has ever happened before to anyone. So what could we possibly do, right? What percentage of the American population reacted like that? A lot, right? We said nothing new can happen, and then when something new happens, you say, nothing like this has ever happened to anyone before, right? That's the American national reaction. So, and that's history, right? History tells you that not everything is totally new, that shocks are normal, right? That in the course of human events, things change, and sometimes you have to react, as Danielle was saying. You have to think about how you're going to react. And I would go a tiny bit further down this conservative alley and say the Constitution. The thing that particularly bugs me about political conversations in this country is the use of the word leader, which I'm allergic to because the word for a leader in Italian is duce, and the word for a leader in German is Führer. But I don't think that's actually an accident. I mean, a leader is someone who is not designated as part of the constitutional system. It's rare to find a respectable constitution which uses the word leader. And there's a reason for that. A leader is not someone who can be defined legally or institutionally, right? A leader is someone who by definition is in an exceptional situation where you have to follow and I have to lead, right? Like there's a fire and I know where the exit is. And that's a different version of politics, the state of exception where I have to lead because, the building's on fire, right? For those of you watching the internet, the building is not actually on fire. Everything is fine. The audience is here. They're laughing at my jokes. It's chill. But this, yeah. This is that's like the famous First Amendment exception, which I just blew. But my point is that Americans like to talk about leaders, good leader, bad leader, strong leader. There aren't any leaders in our Constitution, right? It's a very simple thing, but there's a president, or there aren't leaders. And if we got our kids to think about the vocabulary of the Constitution, then I think we would set some constraints on how we talk about politics. It's not a small mistake. A lot of people vote the way they do because they really think that someone can be a leader and just transform the whole system right away. They have unrealistic expectations because of the words that we use. The word leader creates an unrealistic expectation. Another little really conservative point is about genre. Why should we study literature? Again, not because I need you to learn this novel or that novel or this poem or that poem, but because literature is a genre. It's a genre of fiction, right? Knowing what fiction is really important. If you don't know what fiction is, then you don't recognize it, right? And I mean this 100% seriously. A lot of what is happening in America right now, and not just America, is that fiction is encroaching into real life. A generic boundary has been crossed. It's not just an irony that an entertainer is president, right? It's that this fictional character has crossed the generic line from it wasn't literature, it was television, but has crossed the generic line into real life. And that he doesn't tell the truth is normal because he's not from a genre where you tell the truth, right? And so if one thinks of literature and life, right, one can notice these kinds of things like, oh, television is one thing, and the presidency is another thing, right? And it's from literature that you learn that kind of distinction. Another super conservative point is about math. I think the conversation about inequality in this country is difficult for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that if I say $6 trillion to $21 trillion is now in hiding offshore, which it is, and that's the fundamental political problem, I think, in the world, there just aren't that many people who know how much money that is, right? The difference between $1 trillion and $1 billion and $1 million is lost on a lot of folks. And when we talk about taxes, it's just true that a lot of people in our country cannot imagine somebody making $100,000 or $200,000, or they don't know the difference between making $200,000 and, let's say, $10 million. A lot of what's going on in this country hangs on the difference between the top 1%, the top 0.1%, and the top 0.01%, where the action really has been in the last 25 years. But if people don't know percentages and arithmetic, you can't get your mind around that. So I think the math is really important in getting people out of the sado-populist situation into a policy situation. Because if you don't get the math, you don't see how this is a collective problem, right? And you don't see how it can be dealt with policy instruments. So I mean, those are my super conservative points about curriculum, which may be fantastically out of touch with the way the world really works. But I'm just going to close on this one. The gadget should not be in the classroom, right? That's been a total disaster. I mean, I realize that in some places it's justified. Like, I was just in a Quaker school in Costa Rica where they use the chrome because the humidity destroys the paper and it's too expensive to have a Xerox machine. I get it. Sometimes it helps, but as a presumption, the gadgets have been a disaster. It's not. I mean, here's my test, right? What do the people who make the gadgets do in their own schools? And the answer is, in their own schools, they don't allow the gadgets, right? The people who make the gadgets send their kids to schools without gadgets. So I mean, and it's important for the reasons of corporeality, of physical conversation that we've been talking about. If you, sir, if you have your laptop between yourself and me, then we don't have these nice moments of eye contact where I can tell when you agree and you don't agree, I think. If you're staring at your laptop, we're not actually communicating. The science on this is actually overwhelming. I can cite you some fantastic stuff about how badly students do in exams. It turns out that even if you can see your phone, if you can see it, it knocks your test scores down. Yeah, it does. And the reason is that there's a neural reason for this, which is that your brain recognizes this as part of its memory capacity. So if you can see it but not use it, it takes your test scores down, right? So kids will do a letter grade better on tests if they leave their phones at home, right? And like that's true for kind of all of us all the time. All right, so I'm dwelling on this, but I'm trying to bring us back to a theme, which is that a lot of, the Greeks thought democracy happens among physical people in real life, and they had a point. If we're in doubt, the presumption has to be to get into a situation where physical people are talking to other physical people, and I think that holds for the classroom too.
So I wanted to just follow up on one point for the sake, we've had a lot of strenuous agreement on this panel. We might as well have one strenuous disagreement. And so I would offer a quite different account of the concept of leaders and leadership, though you'll notice I've said leaders, I didn't say a leader or the leader, and I would agree with you about the danger of thinking that there should be the leader or a leader. That is absolutely problematic. But in fact, democracies are distinguished by a greater need for leadership than other political forms. Why is that? Very basic. Democracies have more committees. They just do. There are many more leadership roles in democracies than any other political form. And people need to recognize that as a part of preparing young people for citizenship. We rule and we rule in turn. So to be a leader is also to be a follower and to expect, there's this sort of back and forth, to be a partner in effect. But actually thinking self-consciously about leadership and what it means to do it well, which requires a partnering concept, not an absolutist concept, seems to me fundamental if you're thinking about democratic education.
Yeah, I am just blown away by this. I was chuckling a little as both Danielle and Tim started talking about the gadgets, as I now have a rule in my meetings that my meetings will be gadget-free, to try to get people to actually look at each other and talk to each other and engage with each other as opposed to looking at their gadgets. But now I will invoke the two of you in this process. But I do, there's, we have a couple of minutes for questions, and I don't want to use my, I don't want to disrupt that. I just want to say, just again, how much, and I've written about 7 pages of notes here, just how rich this conversation has been. And I don't know if others in the audience feel that way, but you've given us such depth of thoughtfulness in not just responding to this, but in giving us, at least at the AFT, a sense of lots of approaches that we can now take in terms of how we navigate this. So, for example, one of the things I'm going to talk to our Ed Issues department about, and the Shanker Institute, is maybe we should actually have some kind of nationwide, and I don't think contest is the right word, but some kind of nationwide engagement on the Declaration of Independence. And use Share My Lesson and others as a way of engaging teachers from classrooms all throughout the country to do that and to have that kind of guided debates, and then bring maybe, some of the winners of the contest to our convention to actually make this important and do that. And I really thank you for that. And Tim, I really thank you for actually helping us be a union of readers again. and a union where, and I see some people around who, have knew Al, far longer than I did, how Al Shanker would often go to a meeting of members or leaders or activists with a book to read and to say, let's all kind of read it and think about it. And because both of you have said, let's actually kind of think about what this moment is in the course of history and what we need to do about it. And I am very, very, very grateful that that was the kind of tenor and tone of our conversation.